So in this lesson, we're going to be considering how to use the supply and demand model, which we've developed in the last few lessons, to consider practical issues that come to play every day. You read about it in the newspaper, watch it on TV, it affects you in your everyday life. So this supply and demand model we now want to use in practice and give some examples. The first example has to do with oil. Oil is produced by many countries. It's produced by the United States, it's produced in China, it's produced in Saudi Arabia, all over the world, and it's also consumed all over the world, consumed in Europe, consumed in the United States, of course. And so you think about oil, the oil market, the best way to think about it is as a global market. Oil is all around the world, and when the demand goes up, it's a world demand shift. And when the supply goes up, it has to do with the production of oil throughout the world. It's a very homogeneous commodity. Not literally, they're not all exactly the same, there are different grades, but it's very close to a commodity which is best thought of as a global commodity, global market. So when you think about applying the supply and demand model to oil, you should think about the global market. And so this picture here tries to do that. It gives you the actual supply and demand curve. So the supply curve is in blue there, and it's a particular slope, elasticity, that's been estimated by economists doing empirical work, looking at oil prices and oil supply around the world. And you can see on the horizontal axis, we're looking at million barrels a day of production, and we're looking at the price in dollars per barrel in this particular episode that we're looking at here. The demand curve is also drawn in red, and that represents a global demand for oil. And of course, the higher oil prices are, the quantity demanded of oil goes down because people reduce their quantity when they see the price rises. Gasoline prices go up and other heating oil prices go up. So the quantity demanded, as usual, in demand curves goes down when the price goes up. For supply, when the supply is, you're seeing the producers around the world of oil, when the price of oil goes up for whatever reason, then they're going to tend to produce more oil. That's what it's showing. And the numbers are important. The sizes of those curves, the elasticity of the curves are important. Again, they're estimated. Now this example, I want to ask, what would happen if somehow in the United States the demand for oil declined? And let's suppose it declined by 10% of U.S. consumption. So that's a big decline, 10% of U.S. consumption of oil in a particular period. We want to ask, what does that do to oil prices? Well, first of all, the United States consumes about 23% of total oil in the world. And so a 10% decline in the U.S. represents a 2.3% decline in the demand for the world as a whole. And so to analyze this, we're going to shift the demand curve over to the left by 2.3%. And that's the shift in demand occurred by some policy in the United States. It might be a policy that limits the amount of oil that can be consumed or requires that people use alternatives to oil in their heating or in their production of gasoline. Whatever it does, it's a government policy, whatever, it shifts the demand for oil down by 2.3%. Now, given this model, we can figure out what the impact is on the price. And so, as usual, the shift in the curve from the red to the green means you're moving down the supply curve. And the supply curve represents the behavior of the producers. So there's some less demand, so their price starts to go down, and they're going to produce less as a result. And then what we're going to do is predict that we went from this initial equilibrium to that equilibrium. And as a result, the quantity of production in the world goes down. It goes down by 1%. That's smaller than the 2.3% that the U.S. consumption fell by as a fraction of the world market. So and that's because of this change in price. The change in price has affected the suppliers. It has also affected the amount demanded in the world as a whole. And the price itself also falls. The price falls by, in that amount, which is 4.5% decline. So we've got a decline in price of 4.5% and decline in total production by 1%. And in a way, it's kind of surprising. The U.S. reduces its production by 10%. That's a gigantic amount. But globally, it's only a reduction of 1%. And that's for two reasons. One, the U.S. is not the entire world market. And two, there are these price responses that affect how much is supplied and how much is demanded, in addition to this shift in the demand curve. So this is a real-world example. This is how economists use the supply and demand model. It's not made-up numbers, it's real numbers, and it gives you a sense of how useful these kinds of things are, whether you want to look at the impact of a change in policy in the United States or an embargo on an oil producer. You can use this kind of model. Let's consider another example of how these kinds of models are used, and that is to examine interventions in the market by the government. Very important idea. Sometimes governments, whether it's a local government or a national government, will decide they don't like the price that's coming out of the market. They'd like to have higher prices or lower prices, like lower prices if they're concerned about the consumer, higher prices if the government is concerned more about the firms. So that creates this concept of price ceilings or price floors. A price ceiling, which I can represent in this picture, is where there's a maximum price that the government allows for this particular product. In this case, the price is not going to be at that equilibrium anymore, and so you're going to have to decide whether it's on the supply curve or on the demand curve. And here you have to realize, of course, that in a market, whether it's for bikes or for apples or whatever it happens to be, oil, the decision about the total amount of production is made by the firms, not by the consumers. The firms are producing it. So the amount that's actually produced is going to be on the supply curve, which is what the firm's behavior is. So when you draw that price across the diagram horizontally, you're going to see that, of course, there's a difference of the quantity demanded and the quantity supplied, and the quantity supplied is less than the quantity demanded. The quantity supplied is how much is actually going to be out there. Consumers, of course, they'd like to consume a lot more at that low price on the demand curve, but the goods aren't being produced. So that creates this gap, and that gap is called a shortage. So when you have price ceilings like this, there are generally going to be shortages in the market. Consumers would like to get more at that price, they can't. One of the most common examples of price ceilings like this in markets is the controls on rents for apartments. Firms will be told, landlords will be told they can't charge more than a certain amount of rent, and so if that maximum, that ceiling is less than the equilibrium, there'll be a shortage of apartments in that particular area. Or what might happen is the firms will say, well, I can't produce that many apartments at low price, so maybe I can produce cheaper apartments, or maybe apartments where I won't do the maintenance very much, or I won't paint or fix the plumbing, so the quality will decline. And so there's an impact in the shortage that way, the quality changes itself. So these kinds of impacts can certainly affect markets, and for the most part, economists feel that that equilibrium price results in a transactions or a quantity produced which is efficient and good in many respects. We'll talk about that. And when you move off of that, you create problems like shortages or lower quality. The other case is when there's a price floor, and that's illustrated here. The price floor is where the price can't go below a certain point. So in this supply and demand diagram, I've of course shown the intersection between supply and demand. That's the equilibrium price. But now suppose the government says you can't produce and sell at a price lower than this. This is actually occurs, say, for the milk market in the United States. The government will establish a price where they will make sure the price doesn't go below that. Sometimes they do it by buying up surplus milk. In any case, that's the maximum, that's the price floor, the minimum price. And you can see in the diagram the same kind of thing happens as before. In this case, the quantity supplied is greater than the quantity demanded at that higher price. And so firms will want to produce more than at the equilibrium because the price is higher. But unless the government sucks up the surplus and buys that extra milk from the producers, there's going to be a surplus. The milk, if it's like, will pile up because consumers are not going to buy so much milk at that high price. So the government has to create this demand, if you like, on their own to create that price high. But again, it's a situation where government is intervening in the market, and the price at this higher level results in a surplus. One of the most widely discussed and controversial examples of price intervention by government is the minimum wage. Minimum wage basically says you can't pay workers less than a certain amount. It occurs in states, it occurs at the federal government, and this is an example of the governor of California signing a bill to raise the minimum wage in California from $8 an hour to $10 an hour. So can the supply and demand model be used to analyze the impact of this? Yes, so let's do it. In this case, you want to think about the supply and demand for labor. And I've drawn this in the picture. The labor demand is downward sloping, and the labor supply is upward sloping. Labor demand you want to think of as derived from the firm's behavior, because business firms hire labor. They're the ones that are creating the jobs and hiring the workers. So the idea here is the higher the wage, the higher they have to pay the workers, the smaller, the lower the quantity of labor demanded will be. So it's a downward sloping demand curve, but it's demand for labor rather than for apples or for oil, and that's what the firms represents the firm's own profit maximizing decision. The other curve is labor supply, which may slope up and may reflect the fact that if you are able to earn more for job, you might work more. You might decide to take a job you might not otherwise take if the wage is higher. So it tends to be upward sloping. And this is a very important topic which deserves a lot more discussion, which will be coming later in this course. But for now, let's just think about the implication of this model for the minimum wage decision. So minimum wage comes into place by using that same labor supply and labor demand diagram and drawing in a wage which is higher than the equilibrium. Okay, so this may be the $10 amount that's coming in California, and maybe the equilibrium is $8, $7, $5. In any case, it's below the $10. And when you draw a curve like this, it's got to refer to some type of labor, and so we're really affecting to relatively less skilled workers who would be affected or by a minimum wage like this. You're not talking about people that are making tens of thousands a year. This is a relatively low income application. But you can see right away that the same kind of thing happens. In this case, the labor demand curve is going to be determining the amount of labor actually employed, so you'll be on that red line. Workers will say, hey, I really want to take this job that's now $10 an hour, and firms will say, hey, but I can't employ this many workers at $10 an hour. So those who have jobs will benefit from the higher wage, but there'll also be some people who will not get jobs. There'll be some unemployment caused by the higher wage. And that's really the conundrum that laws like minimum wages occur. You're going to help some people that are already working who will not be laid off because they're going to get a couple more dollars an hour by this. But you're also making it more costly to hire workers, and that's going to make unemployment higher for those workers. Now, of course, the real issue here is that elasticity we talked about in past lesson. If the curve, labor demand curve, is very, very steep, that would be very inelastic, low price elasticity of labor demand, then you would get very small change in the quantity. So you wouldn't get much of an employment effect or an unemployment effect. So much of the debate about the impact of a minimum wage has to do with the steepness or the elasticity of labor demand. And finally, example which is can be illustrated in the same way as this is the case where you have agricultural supports. And this is a very famous example, also has to do with California, by the way. This is a picture of raisins dancing. It's a famous advertisement that was created years ago to help people, to encourage people to buy more raisins. And it's caused by a policy in California where there's a group called the Raisin Administrative Committee, and it's really endorsed by the U.S. Department of Agriculture, USDA. And what they do is they buy raisins, take raisins, I should say, from producers, so they reduce the supply. And as you know from these models, if you reduce the supply, you're going to drive up the price. So the Raisin Administrative Committee has actually created a policy where they can pull raisins off the market, reduce the supply, raise the price, and their effort is to try to make raisin prices higher. This has been in existence since the 1940s and 1950s. It's recently been challenged, and because people realize, well, why should you have a government law that makes people pay more for raisins? And so we're not clear where this is going to turn out, but recently it's been taken to the Supreme Court. Justice Breyer argues he can't believe that Congress wanted the taxpayers to pay for a program that's going to mean they have to pay higher prices as consumers, higher prices for raisins. And Justice Kagan argues this is the world's most outdated law. So they're using these kinds of models and calculations to say, hey, maybe this is not the greatest policy to have, but you don't know that unless you approach it with these kinds of models. So all three of these examples, whether it's the oil market, whether it's the labor market, whether it's the raisin market, illustrate in practice, in real-world terms, how the supply and demand model works. Thank you. See you next time.